On Saturday, October 12, 2024, when the midday sun was still warming the rocks of the Taurus Mountains, two German tourists, Hans and Ingrid Müller, left the well-trodden path of the Lycian Way. They were looking for a secluded place to rest, away from other hiking groups. They ventured into a gorge overgrown with wild juniper bushes about 30 kilometers northwest of the resort town of Kemmer. The air was dry and still, broken only by the crunch of gravel under their boots and the chirping of cicadas. It was then that Hans noticed a structure barely visible against the gray rock, an old stone hut of the kind once used by shepherds. The roof, made of roughly hewn logs, had partially collapsed, and the only window, without glass, resembled a dark hole. The door, made of planks darkened by time, was ajar. Driven by simple curiosity, the couple approached. Already at the entrance, they smelled a faint, barely perceptible, sweetish, cadaverous odor, which they attributed to a dead animal. Ingrid stayed outside, while Hans crouched down and stepped into the semi-darkness. It was cool and damp inside. It took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. The first thing he saw was rubbish scattered on the earthen floor, old tin cans, scraps of fabric. But then his gaze shifted to the far corner. There, leaning against the wall, sat a figure. At first, he thought it was a mannequin left behind by someone as a macabre joke. The figure was dressed in what had once been an elegant evening gown made of dark blue silk. The fabric was rotten and covered with mold, but the style was still recognizable. When Hans took another step, he realized his mistake. It wasn't a mannequin. It was a human skeleton. The bones, perfectly white and clean, were completely stripped of flesh. The skull was tilted slightly toward the shoulder, and the empty eye sockets seemed to stare at the floor. But the most blood-curdling horror was not the skeleton itself, but what surrounded it. A thick, rusty chain stretched from the left ankle, where the shin bone joined the foot. The other end was embedded in the wall with a massive iron ring driven between the stones of the masonry. The skeleton's hands were folded on its knees, as if in a posture of submissive expectation. Hans froze, unable to utter a sound. He silently backed away, left the hut, grabbed his wife by the hand, and dragged her several meters away. Only then was he able to utter a few words in German in a strangled voice. Ingrid did not immediately understand what he had seen, but the expression on his face told her everything. Overcoming the trembling in his hands, Hans took out his cell phone. The signal was weak, but he managed to dial the emergency number, 112. The conversation was intermittent and difficult due to the language barrier. His broken English mixed with German exclamations, and the operator on the other end of the line tried to use standard phrases to determine their location based on geolocation data. About 2 hours later, as the sun began to set, the first responders arrived at the scene, a crew from the local gendarmerie. 2 officers armed with automatic rifles first cordoned off the hut without going inside and questioned the shocked tourists. They acted methodically and without emotion, their movements honed by years of service. Soon, an investigation team from Antalya arrived via the rough mountain road, including forensic experts and detectives from the homicide division. The site was illuminated by powerful portable floodlights, transforming the secluded gorge into a surreal scene filled with people in white protective suits. The work continued throughout the night. The forensic experts carefully examined every inch of the hut. They photographed the remains from all angles, measured the length of the chain, and studied how the ring was attached to the wall. One of the experts carefully removed several preserved fibers from the dress with tweezers for further analysis. Another sifted through the dust on the dirt floor in search of microparticles, hair, fibers from someone else's clothing, any traces that could indicate the presence of another person. After examining the skeleton at the scene, the forensic expert made a preliminary conclusion. The remains belonged to a woman between the ages of 20 and 30 at the time of death. It was impossible to determine the cause of death at the scene due to the complete absence of soft tissue. However, the very fact that the body was chained left no doubt that this was a murder committed with particular cruelty. The next day, October 13th, the Antalya Provincial Security Directorate issued a short official statement to the press. It reported the discovery of unidentified human remains in a mountainous area. No details about the victim's clothing, chain, or field were mentioned so as not to cause panic and interfere with the investigation. The news was reported locally as a minor event. No one yet knew that this gruesome discovery in an abandoned shepherd's hut would be the beginning of one of the most complex and confusing investigations in the region's history, spanning several countries and uncovering a dark tale of deception, obsession, and cold-blooded murder. At that point, the investigation had nothing to go on. No name of the victim, no suspects, no motives. Only a skeleton in an evening gown, chained to a wall in the heart of the silent Turkish mountains. The investigation began in absolute silence, in the sterile whiteness of the forensic laboratory in Antalya. The remains, carefully cleaned and laid out on a metal table in anatomical order, became the only silent witness. A team led by Dr. Aykan Demir, one of Turkey's leading forensic anthropologists, set to work. The first task was to create as complete a biological profile of the victim as possible. Examination of the pelvic bones and skull structure confirmed the initial assessment. It was a woman. The degree of fusion of the epiphyseal plates of the long bones and the condition of the pubic symphysis narrowed the age range to between 25 and 28 years. Measurements of the femur gave an estimated height of about 170 centimeters. The skull's features pointed to Caucasian ancestry. The experts carefully examined each bone for signs of injuries sustained during life. They found traces of an old, well-healed fracture of the left clavicle. However, no signs of injuries that could have led to death, no skull fractures, knife wounds, or bullet holes in the bones were found. This meant that the cause of death was most likely related to soft tissue damage, poisoning, or, given the circumstances, exhaustion or dehydration. At the same time, work was carried out on the teeth. A dental expert compiled a detailed odontogram: 3 composite fillings on the upper molars and 1 on the lower molars. There was a small chip on the front incisor. No crowns, implants, or signs of complex orthodontic treatment. This data was immediately uploaded to the National Missing Persons Search System. But the system did not return any matches. No one with this dental profile was listed as missing in Turkey. Geneticists were able to extract a DNA profile from the bone tissue, but it also failed to match any records in the Turkish database. The investigation had reached a dead end before it had even begun. They had a skeleton, but no identity. The case was given the code name "Woman in a Blue Dress." While the Turkish police struggled to establish the identity thousands of kilometers away, in a residential area of Kiev, a woman named Elena Petrenko had been living in a state of constant anxiety for almost a year. Her daughter, Margarita, a 27-year-old graphic designer, had stopped communicating on October 29, 2023. Their last conversation had been brief and joyful. Margarita called her mother on video chat from a luxurious apartment with a panoramic view of the sea in Antalya, showed her a huge bouquet of white roses, and said she was pleased. She had moved to Turkey just 2 weeks earlier to be with her fiancé, a Turkish businessman she had met during her summer vacation. After that call, there was silence. At first, Elena wasn't worried, attributing it to the euphoria of a new life and a romantic relationship. But when 3 days passed, and Margarita still hadn't responded to dozens of messages and calls, her mother began to panic. Her daughter's phone was turned off. Elena contacted Margarita's friends, but no one knew anything. She wrote to the man her daughter had left with on social media, but his account had been deleted. A week later, Elena Petrenko went to the police in Kiev. They took her statement and opened a missing person case, but the investigator honestly admitted that their options outside Ukraine were minimal. They sent an official request to the Ukrainian embassy in Ankara and the Turkish National Police through Interpol channels. Elena herself repeatedly called the embassy, where she was politely but unsuccessfully advised to wait for an official response from the Turkish authorities. For the Turkish police, this was one of hundreds of requests about missing foreigners who go missing every year in the huge country. The request was standard. A Ukrainian citizen arrived in the country on such and such a date, is believed to be in Antalya, and no exact address is available. Without any additional information, the case was filed away. Meanwhile, in Antalya, 3 weeks after the body was found, investigators, having exhausted all internal resources, decided to take the search to the international level. The Turkish National Central Bureau of Interpol prepared and sent a so-called Black Notice to all participating countries, a request for information about an unidentified body. The notice contained all the information gathered: gender, approximate age, height, Caucasian race, detailed dental records, and a complete DNA profile. This circular was entered into the database of the Criminal Investigation Department of the National Police of Ukraine in mid-November. A computer algorithm that compares data from notifications with the Ukrainian Missing Persons database found a partial match in the case of Margarita Petrenko. The age, height, and date of disappearance were approximately the same. The investigator in charge of Margarita's case contacted Elena Petrenko and asked her some questions. Did her daughter have any distinguishing features, fractures, or characteristic dental problems? Elena recalled that as a teenager, Margarita had broken her collarbone after falling off her bike, and that she had a small chip on her front tooth, which she had been meaning to have repaired. This was the first serious coincidence. The next decisive step was genetic testing. A sample of buccal epithelium was taken from Elena Petrenko for DNA comparison. The sample was sent by diplomatic mail to Ankara, and from there to a laboratory in Antalya. The wait for the results lasted another 3 weeks. Finally, in early December 2024, the official response arrived. The probability that Elena Petrenko was the mother of the unidentified woman found in the mountains was 99. The nameless skeleton in a decayed blue dress had a name. It was Margarita Petrenko. The woman in a blue dress case was officially reclassified as the murder of Ukrainian citizen Margarita Petrenko. Now the investigation had a starting point. The investigation moved forward, and its focus shifted from the question, "Who is the victim?" to "How did she get here?" and "Who is responsible for this?" First, detectives gathered all the data on Margarita's border crossings, CCTV footage from the airport, and most importantly, began searching for the mysterious Turkish businessman she had come to meet before her death. With Margarita Petrenko's identity established, the investigation entered a new, more substantive phase. Now the detectives had to reconstruct not just the last hours of her life, but the last year, to understand what chain of events had led her to the abandoned hut in the Tavra Mountains. The main investigative work moved to Kiev. 2 detectives from the Antalya Homicide Investigation Department arrived in the Ukrainian capital to coordinate with local police and, most importantly, to talk to people close to the victim. The central figure in this was Margarita's mother, Elena Petrenko, a woman with tired eyes who had refused to believe the worst for a year. During hours of conversations in a gray government office in the Kiev police headquarters, she held back her emotions and painted a portrait of her only daughter. Margarita, according to her mother, was a child of the new generation, independent, determined, and tech-savvy. She was born and raised in Kiev and graduated with honors from the National University of Technology and Design with a degree in graphic design. She did not aspire to work for a large corporation, preferring the freedom of freelancing. Her clients included small startups, cozy coffee shops, and fashionable clothing brands, for whom she created logos and corporate identities. Clean lines and attention to detail characterized her work. She lived in a small but stylishly furnished studio apartment in Padil, worked hard, practiced yoga, and led what appeared to be a completely normal, measured life. Margarita's friends, whom investigators also met, added to this portrait. They described her as an incorrigible dreamer, a person who believed in grand, cinematic love. Despite her outward pragmatism and ability to deal with clients, she remained vulnerable and romantic at heart. She rarely entered into relationships, telling her friends that she was waiting for the one, and often lamented the superficiality of dating through mobile apps. Margarita's life changed in July 2023. Having saved up money from a large project, she decided to take a week's vacation and flew alone to Antalya for the first time in her life. She booked a room at an expensive 5-star hotel in the Lara district, wanting maximum comfort and security. It was there, in the hotel lobby bar, that she met a man who introduced himself as Altan Demir. Later, in enthusiastic stories to her friends upon her return, she described him as the embodiment of her dreams. He was about 40 years old, tall, elegantly dressed, spoke flawless English with a slight accent, and, in her words, had incredible charisma. He said he was the owner of a large construction company involved in the construction of luxury real estate along the coast. All week long, he showered her with attention and luxury, dinners at the most expensive restaurants, trips on a private yacht, and drives in his black premium SUV through the picturesque surroundings. He was attentive, listened to her stories about work and dreams, and admired her talent. For Margarita, who was used to independence, such total attention was intoxicating. When she flew back to Kiev, Altan came to see her off at the airport with a huge bouquet of orchids and a promise that this was only the beginning of their story. And he kept his word. Over the next 3 months, their romance developed remotely, but with incredible intensity. Investigators, having gained access to her cloud storage and messengers, were able to reconstruct the full picture of this psychological manipulation. Every day began with his message, "Good morning, my queen," and ended with a video call lasting several hours. He showed her his villa with a swimming pool and a view of the mountains, sent her photos of real estate documents and expensive cars, creating the image of an extremely successful and wealthy man. About once every 2 weeks, a courier would deliver gifts to Margarita's apartment in Kiev, a bag from a famous French brand, a Swiss watch, and expensive jewelry. The police later checked these transactions and found that they had all been paid for with anonymous prepaid cards purchased with cash at various locations in Istanbul. He constantly talked about the future, about the wedding they would have in Turkey, about children, about how she would be able to decorate their home to her taste, and, if she wanted, open her design studio in Antalya. He slowly but surely isolated her from her familiar world. When one of her friends, Svetlana, expressed doubts about the veracity of such a fairy tale story, Margarita took offense and began to share fewer details with her. She talked more and more with her mother, who, seeing her daughter so happy, did not dare to ask uncomfortable questions and was just happy for her. In early October 2023, Altan proposed to her during a video call, showing her a platinum box with a massive diamond ring on camera. He said he couldn't wait any longer and asked her to move in with him as soon as possible to start a new life. Margarita, completely absorbed in this illusion, agreed without hesitation. Over the next 2 weeks, she lived in a daze. She terminated her apartment lease, notified her clients that she was leaving, sold some of her belongings, and took the most valuable items to her mother's for safekeeping. She bought a one-way ticket to Antalya for October 15, 2023. Her mother and 2 closest friends saw her off at Borispil Airport. She was on cloud 9, constantly showing them photos of the villa where they would live on her phone. She promised to call every day. That was the last time she was seen alive. After arriving in Antalya, she kept in touch with her mother for another 2 weeks. The calls were regular, and she sent photos from restaurants and beach clubs. These were the last bits of information the investigators received. Her life, so bright and full of hope, was cut short suddenly, 2 weeks after she moved. Now the police had a specific task: to find a man named Altan Demir. However, they would soon realize that a man with that name and background most likely never existed. Investigators in Antalya, having obtained the victim's full name, focused all their efforts on finding the man known to Margarita as Altan Demir. This name became the starting point, the key that they hoped would open the door to solving the crime. However, their first attempt ended in complete failure. The name Altan Demir was run through all available government databases: the National Population Registry, the Tax Service, the Registry of Legal Entities, and the Database of Real Estate and Vehicle Owners. The results were discouraging. There were several dozen men with that name living in Turkey. Still, none of them matched the age description, had any connection to the construction business in Antalya, or possessed the wealth described by the suspect. It became clear that Margarita Petrenko had fallen victim to someone using a false name. The investigation shifted to digital and financial traces. Technical experts examined data from Margarita's laptop and phone, which had been left with her mother in Kyiv. They discovered a history of transactions for gifts sent by Altan. These were purchases from online boutiques of luxury brands. Detectives sent official requests to these stores and obtained information about the payment methods used. As expected, the purchases were paid for with virtual prepaid cards that do not require owner identification. However, the police managed to trace the IP addresses from which the transactions were made. All of them led to public Wi-Fi hotspots in large shopping centers in Istanbul, hundreds of kilometers from Antalya. This was the first important fact. The suspect was operating not only in Antalya, but also in Istanbul, and was making serious efforts to remain anonymous. The next step was to review Margarita's arrival in Turkey. Detectives requested and obtained passenger lists for the Kiev-Antalya flight on October 15, 2023, as well as hours of footage from all CCTV cameras in the international terminal of Antalya Airport. 2 analysts spent 3 days reviewing the video footage. Finally, their search was successful. On the recording from the camera above the arrivals area, they saw Margarita pushing her trolley with 2 large suitcases. A few seconds later, a man approached her. His appearance matched the descriptions: tall, about 40 years old, well-built, dressed in an expensive suit. He hugged Margarita and took her trolley. Cameras at the terminal exit and in the parking lot recorded the couple getting into a black SUV of the latest model. The image quality did not allow the license plate number to be fully discernible. Still, 3 digits and 2 letters of the regional code were visible: 07, the code for the province of Antalya. This fragment of the license plate became the main lead. A large-scale check was launched on all black SUVs of this make registered or rented in the province of Antalya on the specified date. The work was titanic, but after a week it paid off. One of the cars, owned by a large international car rental company, had a similar license plate and had been rented for 3 months from September to December 2023. The detectives immediately went to the rental company's office. The manager provided them with a copy of the rental agreement. The car was rented in the name of Murat Yilmaz. Copies of his passport and driver's license were attached to the agreement. The photo on the documents matched the man who met Margarita at the airport. But the investigators' joy was short-lived. A check of the name Murat Yilmaz in the databases showed that the documents were fake. More precisely, they were high-quality duplicates of the documents of the real Murat Yilmaz, a modest teacher from the city of Trabzon, who had never been to Antalya and had never rented expensive cars. His documents had been lost a year earlier. The address listed on the rental agreement turned out to be the address of a hotel under construction. The phone number was registered to an anonymous SIM card and was no longer in service at the end of December 2023. The suspect was a professional at covering his tracks. The only clue was the apartment from which Margarita made her last video call to her mother. Elena Petrenko provided investigators with a screenshot of the conversation. In the background, a panoramic window with a view of the sea and part of a neighboring building was visible. Forensic image analysis experts, together with real estate agents from Antalya, began the difficult task of identifying the location. They analyzed the angle of the sun's rays to determine the orientation of the building, studied the coastline, and the architectural features of the visible buildings. After several days, the search narrowed down to 3 luxury residential complexes in the prestigious Konya Alti district. Detectives visited all 3 complexes, showing the concierges and security guards a photo of the suspect obtained from a copy of a fake passport. In the last building, Panorama Residence, the night porter recognized the man. He confirmed that the man who had introduced himself as Murat had rented a penthouse on the 35th floor for 1 month, from mid-October to mid-November 2023. The lease was arranged through a private real estate agent and paid in full in cash on the day of check-in. The apartment was immediately sealed off and subjected to a thorough forensic examination. Almost a year has passed since then, and during that time, the apartment has had many tenants. The initial examination using standard methods yielded no results. The apartment was spotless. However, a special team of experts was called in to conduct an in-depth analysis. They used the most modern technology, including treating surfaces with chemical reagents to reveal washed-away traces of blood and biological fluids. These searches also proved fruitless. It seemed that the investigation had once again reached a dead end. But one of the most experienced criminologists in the group suggested checking the siphons and drain pipes in the bathroom. Plumbers carefully dismantled the drainage system under the shower stall. Inside, in a layer of soap scum and dirt that had accumulated over many years, among other debris, the expert found several long, dark hairs. They were sent to the laboratory for DNA analysis. 2 days later, the results came back. Some of the hairs belonged to Margarita Petrenko, but one of them belonged to an unknown man. His DNA profile did not match any of those in the Turkish national database. Nevertheless, it was a huge breakthrough. The investigation now had biological material from the elusive killer. They had his DNA, his image from surveillance cameras, and a clear understanding of his methods. The ghost was beginning to take shape. All that remained was to find a name that matched this genetic code. With a photo of the suspect, his DNA, and a clear picture of his methods, the investigation team in Antalya found itself at a crossroads. There were no direct leads that could lead to his true identity. All the traces he left behind led to fake names and disposable contacts. After several meetings with the prosecutor's office, a risky but necessary decision was made to make the investigation public. On the morning of December 28, 2024, a press conference was held at the Antalya Police Headquarters. The head of the Homicide Department, Commissioner Ibrahim Aksoy, appeared before dozens of television cameras and journalists. His statement was dry and measured. He announced that as part of the investigation into the murder of Ukrainian citizen Margarita Petrenko, whose body was found in October, a man whose photograph would now be shown was being sought. Aksoy emphasized that this man was of particular interest to the investigation and could be using various aliases, including Altan Demir and Murat Yilmaz. He urged citizens who may have seen this man or have any information about his whereabouts or true identity to contact the police via a dedicated hotline immediately. At that moment, a clear image of the suspect's face, taken from a copy of a fake driver's license, appeared on the large screens behind him. The effect was immediate. Within hours, the photo was all over Turkish news agencies, evening news programs, newspaper websites, and millions of social media accounts. The police got ready for a flood of calls. A special task force was set up to receive and process the incoming information. As expected, thousands of calls flooded the hotline in the first few days. Detectives worked around the clock, checking every report. 99% of the information turned out to be useless. people mistakenly identified their neighbors, ex-husbands, or random passers-by as the suspect. But the investigators methodically worked through every lead, knowing that even in this flood of noise, there might be a grain of truth. At the same time as the public appeal, the Turkish authorities stepped up international cooperation. Based on the information gathered, the National Bureau of Interpol in Ankara issued a blue notice. Unlike a red notice, which is a request for arrest, a blue notice is an international request for additional information about the identity, location, or criminal activities of a person of interest to the investigation. The notice, containing a photograph of the suspect, his DNA profile, fingerprints taken from the steering wheel of a rented car, and a detailed description of his modus operandi, was sent to all 195 Interpol member countries. The search was now on a global scale. The breakthrough did not come from the public, but as a result of painstaking analytical work within the police itself. One of the analysts on the investigation team in Antalya was tasked with searching police databases, not for a person, but for a method. He created a search query for unsolved cases and reports of fraud over the past 5 years throughout Turkey, using key parameters: victim, foreign citizen, suspect, man posing as a wealthy businessman, scheme, whirlwind romance with promises of marriage, followed by financial fraud. A few days later, the system returned a match. A fraud report was filed 2 years ago in the city of Izmir by a Russian citizen. The woman claimed that a man who introduced himself as Serkan Atasoy, the owner of an export company, gained her trust, started a romantic relationship, and, under the pretext of an urgent need to invest in a lucrative deal, swindled her out of the equivalent of 50,000 euros, after which he disappeared without a trace. Attached to the statement was a photograph taken by the victim during their vacation together. The same face was looking at the investigators in the photograph. Soon, a response came through Interpol channels. The Cyprus police reported that a similar crime had been reported to them about a year and a half ago. The victim was a Polish citizen who lost all her savings. The suspect, whose appearance and methods completely matched the information in the blue notice, used the name Ozan Efe at the time. The investigation reached a new level. It became clear that the murder of Margarita Petrenko was not an isolated crime. It was an escalation, the horrific finale in the activities of a serial predator who had honed his skills of deception over many years. Detectives contacted the victims in Izmir and Cyprus. Their testimony was invaluable. Both women, independently of each other, described him as an extremely persuasive and charming manipulator. He was patient and attentive to detail, memorizing the smallest details of their lives to create a sense of deep emotional connection. He never rushed things, allowing the victim to come to complete trust on her own. He displayed attributes of wealth, but always casually, as if by accident. An expensive watch that was a gift from a partner in Dubai. A random phone call during which he discussed buying a piece of land by the sea. He was a master of creating illusions. Both women also mentioned the same physical feature that was impossible to see in official photographs: a small thin scar above his right eyebrow. Now the police had not just a set of clues, but a complete psychological and behavioral profile. They were not dealing with an ordinary murderer, but with a cold-blooded, calculating, and extremely dangerous predator, who, by all accounts, had crossed the line. The main question now facing the investigation was a frightening one. Why did he change his usual scenario? Why did Margarita, unlike the others, pay for his trust with her life instead of money? Piecing together information about 3 documented episodes of fraud in Turkey and Cyprus, investigators gained a clear understanding of their opponent's psychology and methods. They were dealing with a predator who operated according to a well-rehearsed script, changing names and cities with the same ease with which others change clothes. However, his true identity remained a mystery. The key to solving the case, as is often the case in complex international cases, lay in biometric data. fingerprints, and DNA profiles. These unique biological signatures were sent through Interpol channels to all police departments around the world, with a request to check them against national databases. Responses began to arrive within a few weeks. France, Italy, Spain, Russia, Ukraine, all negative. The suspect's fingerprints and DNA did not appear in their criminal records. This meant that either he had never been caught in these countries, or his previous crimes were not serious enough to warrant the collection of biometric data. The wait dragged on, and tension grew within the investigation team. The breakthrough came at the end of January 2025, originating from an unexpected source. The answer came from the German Federal Criminal Police Office, the Bundeskriminalamt. The automatic fingerprint recognition system found a perfect match. The fingerprints taken from the steering wheel of an SUV rented in Antalya belonged to a man who had been arrested in Berlin 5 years earlier. This man was involved in a case concerning a small criminal group specializing in the manufacture and sale of forged documents. He was detained during a test purchase when he attempted to sell a fake Belgian driver's license. During his arrest, his fingerprints were taken, and a photograph was taken for the police file. According to German records, his name was Hakan Zengin. He was a Turkish citizen. For his crime, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison, served his sentence in Moabit prison, and was deported to his homeland, Turkey, after his release. This was the thread that the investigation clung to with a death grip. German colleagues handed over all the materials they had on the case of Hakan Zengin to the Turkish side, including his date and place of birth, the city of Konya, 1980. Now the faceless ghost had a real name. Detectives immediately checked Hakan Zengin's name in all Turkish databases. The picture that emerged was strikingly different from that of a brilliant millionaire. Hakan Zengin grew up in a poor family on the outskirts of Konya. From a young age, he had problems with the law, several arrests for petty theft, and a suspended sentence for credit card fraud. He never owned a legitimate business, had no real estate except for a share in his parents' house, and moved around constantly. He was a professional criminal, a petty con artist who eventually moved on to bigger game, discovering that defrauding lonely and gullible foreign women was much more profitable and safer. Having established his identity, the investigation returned to the main question: the motive for the murder. Why would Hakan Zengin, an experienced con artist whose main tool was persuasion, not violence, need to kill Margarita? The answer, as it turned out, had been stored all along in the victim's digital archive. Investigators asked Margarita's mother for renewed, more extensive access to her cloud data storage. Technical experts began methodically combing through every file and folder, including hidden and password-protected directories. In one of these folders, labeled Wedding Documents, they found something that changed everything. The folder contained high-quality scans of a fake passport in the name of Altan Demir, which Hakan had sent to Margarita at her request, supposedly to complete the paperwork for their marriage. But next to these scans were other files, screenshots taken by Margarita herself. As a professional graphic designer with a trained eye, she noticed something that would have escaped the attention of the average person. In the screenshots, she enlarged certain sections of the passport. She circled microscopic defects in red, a barely noticeable misalignment of a line of text relative to the state coat of arms, a slight difference in kerning, the space between letters, in his first and last names, and a strange moire pattern on the holographic sticker. Next to it was a text document with a history of her search queries from the last days of her life. Fonts in Turkish passports. Degrees of protection of Turkish passports. How to distinguish a fake passport. Margarita Petrenko understood everything. She had uncovered his deception. The investigation reconstructed the events of late October 2023 with terrifying clarity. Margarita most likely did not cause a scene. She probably confronted him directly, without aggression, presenting her findings and asking for an explanation. For Hakan Zengin, it was a disaster. His carefully constructed world collapsed in an instant. It's one thing for a deceived woman to fly home in tears, but it's quite another for an exposed fraudster whose victim has irrefutable evidence of his crime. If Margarita had gone to the police, his real photo would have been linked to the pseudonym Altan Demir and sent to all law enforcement agencies. That would have been the end of his career. He would no longer have been able to deceive women by showing his face. He was cornered. The murder was not planned. It was a desperate improvisation. He couldn't kill her in an elite apartment without leaving any traces. He had to get her out of there. He tricked or forced her into his car and drove her to the mountains, to a place he probably knew from his youth or had scouted out beforehand as a hideout in case of emergency. An old shepherd's hut became Margarita's prison and grave. The gruesome staging, the evening gown, the chain, was the last act of his power over her, a cruel and symbolic punishment for daring to expose him. He left her to die a slow and painful death, confident that her body would never be found in this remote location. Now the police had everything: the killer's name, his DNA, his fingerprints, and a clear motive. Only one thing remained: to find and arrest Hakan Zengin. With the true identity of Margarita Petrenko's killer established, the investigation entered its final and most dynamic phase: the manhunt. An arrest warrant for Hakan Zengin on charges of premeditated murder was issued immediately. His photo, now with his real name, was again distributed to all media outlets, but this time with the note: dangerous, wanted for murder. Task forces were dispatched to all known addresses associated with Zengin. One team searched his parents' modest home in Konya. The elderly couple claimed they had not seen their son in over 2 years and had no contact with him. Another team broke into a cheap rented apartment in a working-class suburb of Istanbul, which he had been using as his base. The apartment was empty. Judging by the layer of dust and the lack of fresh food, he had left several months earlier, long before the police were on his trail. Hakan Zengin, as befits an experienced criminal, had no permanent residence and was ready to disappear at any moment. Realizing that their target was a master of conspiracy, investigators focused on tracking his digital and financial traces, now linked to his real name. An analysis of his bank accounts showed that he was leading a double life. He created the illusion of untold wealth for his victims while living extremely frugally, using small amounts of cash that he withdrew from various ATMs across the country. The police mapped his movements over the past year based on cash withdrawals and ping signals from disposable mobile phones that he periodically activated. A clear route emerged. After Margarita's murder, he went into hiding in Istanbul, and when his photo appeared in the press as a person of interest to the investigation, he began to move east, toward the Iranian border. He realized that his identity would soon be revealed and prepared to leave the country. Once again, public assistance played a decisive role. After a report with Zengin's real name and photo was shown on television, the driver of an intercity bus traveling from Ankara to Van called the police. He recognized the wanted criminal as a quiet passenger who had been on his bus 3 days earlier. The driver remembered him well because he had paid with a large bill, looked very nervous, and had kept his eyes fixed on the window the entire journey, as if afraid of being followed. This information narrowed the search area to the province of Van, a vast and mountainous region bordering Iran and known for its smuggling routes. All police and gendarmerie units in the region were put on alert. Mass checks of small hotels, guest houses, and hostels began. Intelligence tracked the activation of a new disposable phone in the area of Dogubayazit, located at the foot of Mount Ararat, a few kilometers from the border. Early in the morning, an hour before dawn, special police forces surrounded a small, dilapidated motel on the outskirts of the city. Acting quickly and silently, they broke down the door to a room on the second floor. Hakan Zengin was taken by surprise. He offered no resistance. All his glamour and charisma disappeared without a trace. Sitting on the bed in front of the police was an emaciated 45-year-old man with a blank stare. A backpack was found in the room, containing wads of cash in various currencies, several new fake passports with his photo but different names, and a laptop. A search of the laptop revealed that he had already chosen his next victim, a nurse from Norway, with whom he had been actively corresponding under the guise of a Swedish engineer. During questioning, Hakan Zengin behaved calmly, denying any involvement in the murder. He admitted to the fraud, presenting it as voluntary gifts from women who were in love with him, but claimed that he had left Margarita in Antalya alive and well. However, the evidence gathered was irrefutable. The trial took place at the Antalya Heavy Crimes Court and lasted 4 months. The prosecution methodically presented all the evidence: a match between the DNA found in the hut and Zengin's DNA, his fingerprints in the rented car, witness statements identifying him, CCTV footage, and finally, correspondence and files from Margarita's laptop proving that she had exposed him. The women he had deceived in Izmir and Cyprus also testified as witnesses for the prosecution, their stories painting a clear picture of the defendant as a serial predator. The court found Hakan Zengin guilty of premeditated murder, committed with particular cruelty, as well as fraud on a huge scale and forgery of documents. The court sentenced him to the maximum penalty under Turkish law: life imprisonment in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. The case received widespread publicity in both Turkey and Ukraine, becoming a tragic example of the dangers lurking behind the facade of ideal online dating. Margarita's mother, Elena Petrenko, attended all court hearings. After the verdict was announced, she did not give detailed comments to the press, saying only that justice had been done, but that it would never bring her daughter back. Margarita Petrenko's story, which began as a fairy tale of love and luxury, ended in a courtroom, leaving behind only a bitter reminder of how easily a dream can turn into a nightmare, and a skeleton in an evening gown chained to a wall in the silent Turkish mountains.